After the end of the Mexican War in 1848, the issue of the extension of slavery into all these new territories, this issue stirred up fierce debate and insults and even violence between partisans from the free states in the north and partisans from the slave states in the south. This mounting tension and hostility between these two sections, north and south, would eventually result in the succession of most of the slave states and the formation of the Confederate States of America in 1861. It would only be civil war, the American Civil War, also known as the War between the States, that would restore the Union and ultimately resolve the issue of slavery through the abolition of slavery with the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. These events were very significant in American history, and historians sometimes refer to the American Civil War as the Second American Revolution because of these radical changes that took place in American society with the abolition of slavery. In this lesson, we are going to examine the early stages of this escalating crisis of the Union. We're going to begin with the election of 1848, where the issue of the extension of slavery was first discussed. Then we're going to discuss the crisis of 1850. This came about over the issue of admitting California into the Union. And finally, we're going to talk about the Compromise of 1850 and how this compromise temporarily ended the crisis, but ultimately seeded new tensions and resulted in new tensions between North and South. So let's begin by looking at the election of 1848. With the end of the war, all this new territory had been obtained from Mexico. And the issue was what to do with these new territories. Now, the election of 1848 would result in the formation of a third political party known as the Free Soil Party. Now, this Free Soil Party didn't have much success, but it's important because it was the predecessor of the future Republican Party. And also, this Free Soil Party foreshadowed the future collapse of a national system of two parties, because this Free Soil Party and the later Republican Party was only found up north. So we begin to see the problem of the destruction of the national two-party system. Now, in 1848, the Democrats nominated as their presidential candidate Senator Lewis Cass of Michigan. Now, he was a senior senator. He was an old-time Jacksonian Democrat, and he hoped to unify the country through expanding on this idea of manifest destiny. He was following the example of Polk. You know, the Democrats had had great success with Polk, and they thought that they could continue with this strategy. Now, he called for the annexation of Cuba and the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. Now, why did he do this? Well, there was believed that out of these territories, future slave states could be carved up. And so the idea that this would add new slave states to the Union. And also, Lewis Cass had a democratic answer to the problem of extending slavery. He called it popular sovereignty. The idea would be that to resolve the issue of slavery, people in the territory themselves, that they would be the one to decide whether they wanted to enter the Union as a slave state or a free state. It was a good Jacksonian democratic idea, you know, let the people decide. Now, the Whigs, they nominated Zachary Taylor. Now, they were following a strategy that had worked in the past. They were nominating a war hero. You know, they had William Henry Harrison had enjoyed success in 1840. The idea was that Taylor would have the same success, you know, being the old rough and ready, the hero of Buena Vista. And now Taylor was pretty smart. He knew that the issue of slavery was very controversial among the Whigs, so during the campaign he avoided the issue of slavery altogether and really focused on his war hero record. Now, the nomination of Cass and Taylor created problems for both Democrats and Whigs up north. Now, many Democrats up north, like in places like New York and Pennsylvania, were opposed to the extension of slavery. And they opposed Cass' nomination because he was calling for the extension of slavery through popular sovereignty into the new territory. So these Democrats who were opposed to the extension of slavery became known as Wilmot Democrats. They were named after a man by the name of David Wilmot. He was a member of the House of Representatives from the state of Pennsylvania. See, back in 1846, at the start of the Mexican War, he had put forward an idea, a bill called the Wilmot Proviso. And what this bill said would be that in the new territories acquired from Mexico, no black people would be allowed to settle there. And the idea would be this would prevent people from bringing slaves into these new territories. He wanted to stop the extension of slavery. Now, this bill that was proposed, this proviso, Wilmot Proviso, it passed in the House of Representatives. Remember, the House of Representatives was based on population. By this time, more people lived in the North than in the South. So it had the votes to pass in the House of Representatives. But when it got to the Senate, remember in the Senate, every state has the same number of votes. In the Senate, it was blocked. So the Wilmot Proviso never was made law. But it was something that rallied Democrats in the North opposed to the extension of slavery. Now the Whigs up north, there were Whigs up north who were also had problems with their party's candidate. They were called conscience Whigs. Now these conscience Whigs were opposed to Taylor, Zachary Taylor's candidacy, because, well, Taylor was a Southerner. He lived in Louisiana, and he was one of the wealthiest slave owners in the country. He owned over 500 slaves. And so many Northern Whigs were completely opposed to his nomination. And they argued that Whigs who supported Taylor were what they called cotton Whigs, either Southern plantation owners who were Whigs or greedy, as they saw it, greedy Northern textile mill operators who only cared about the cotton trade. And these people are saying, hey, we have a conscience. We cannot support Taylor. So what happened is that in 1848, these conscious Whigs from the North and these Wilmot Democrats from the North, they got together and they organized a new political party, the Free Soil Party. They were called the Free Soil Party because they wanted free soil. They opposed completely any extension of slavery into any of the new territories which had been acquired from Mexico. They wanted all these territories to be added to the Union as free states. Now, they found a nominee, Martin Van Buren. Former President Martin Van Buren, former Democrat Martin Van Buren was the candidate for this Free Soil Party. Now, in the election of 1848, Americans had a sense of nationalism in the sense that they rallied behind the war hero, the hero of Buena Vista, the hero of the Mexican War, old Rough and Ready. And Zachary Taylor won the election and defeated Lewis Cass. Now the Free Soil Party did not carry a single state. It didn't win that many votes. But, you see, its existence would be the nucleus of what would later become the Republican Party of the 1850s. Now, in the 1848 election, the issue of slavery in the territories was just a theoretical discussion. I mean, none of these territories were going to become states anytime soon. But that all changed because of the California gold rush in 1849. They discovered gold at Sutter's Mill in the Sacramento Valley of Northern California, and all of a sudden you had literally thousands and thousands of people going to California hoping to find gold and strike it rich. Just to give you an idea of how many people moved so fast. The port of San Francisco. San Francisco was a tiny, basically a Mexican village at the beginning in 1848, and by the end of 1849, it had become a city of 20,000 people. It was the main port of entry into the California gold fields. Now, in December of 1849, California had enough people, so they convened for a constitutional convention to write up a constitution for the new state of California. Now, when they had this constitutional convention, they voted that California would be a free state and they would prohibit slavery in the new proposed state. Now, it's important to remember that these delegates to this convention were not opposing slavery for moral reasons. Maybe some of them were, who knows. But the main reason why they opposed slavery is because they didn't want slave owners to come in with a bunch of their slaves and find the gold. I mean, remember the gold rush was still in full swing, and they thought that slave owners would have an unfair advantage if they could bring their slaves in to find the gold. So pretty much for economic reasons, they wanted to enter the Union as a free state. Now, when California applied to join the Union as a free state, this got everybody up in arms. The Southerners were outraged. Slave owners were outraged because they were afraid that this was going to set a dangerous precedent. You know, if this state enters the Union as a free state, maybe they all will. Now, in 1850, Senator John C. Calhoun was, he was dying. He was a very old man at this point, but he was so sick that when he had to address the Senate, he had to have somebody else read his speech because he was that ill. But in a very prophetic speech, he said that if the number of free states continued to grow, and if free states outnumbered the slave states, then the South would be doomed, and their institution of slavery would be doomed, and that the only course of action for the South would be succession, and that to avoid a tyranny of the majority. So in 1850, he died soon after that, but Calhoun pretty much called it the way he saw it, and he was right. Now, in 1850, Southerners decided to take action, and there was a convention of Southern slave owners in Nashville, Tennessee in 1850. And among the people who attended this convention were the so-called fire eaters. These were fiery speakers who were defenders of the institution of slavery. One such person was Senator Jefferson Davis of Mississippi. Another such person, another leader, and another prominent fire eater was William Yancey of Alabama, another senator. Now, at this convention, they demanded that Congress immediately pass a federal slave code that would protect the rights of slave owners. They were arguing that owning slaves was a right, and that these slave owners needed to have their rights protected so they could bring slaves into these territories. Now, in 1850, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, these veterans of the Senate, they'd been around forever, they wanted to keep the Union together. They did not want to see the Union fall apart. So Henry Clay and Daniel Webster worked with members of Congress to try to reach a compromise that would bring the country together and resolve the issue, end the crisis. Now, Henry Clay had a plan. His plan was this. California would enter the Union as a free state. That's what the people of California wanted. The plan would also create two new territories, New Mexico and Utah. And the idea would be that the residents of these territories would decide when they wanted to join the Union whether they wanted to be a free state or a slave state. So it was the principle of popular sovereignty would be put into effect to resolve the issue of slavery in those two territories. Also, as part of the plan, a bunch of territory was taken that was claimed by the state of Texas, was taken from Texas, and Texas was paid $10 million as compensation for giving up that territory. And the money was to be used by Texas to pay off its debts that it had incurred when it was an independent republic. Now, Clay knew that Southerners were giving up a lot, so he wanted to have something to appease Southerners. So they proposed the Fugitive Slave Law. Now, under this law, federal agents would have the authority to go into any state and track down runaway slaves and return them to the owner. So it was an expansion of the federal government. And now the reasons why this was popular in the South is because there was a problem. A lot of slaves were actually escaping slavery. By this period of time, there was a secret underground organization called the Underground Railroad. And it was a secret network that was manned by abolitionists and former slaves. And the idea was to help runaway slaves from the South move through the North and get to Canada. Remember, Canada was under British control and slavery had been illegal there since 1834. Now, there was a woman named Harriet Tubman, a former slave, who was very prominent in working to help these runaway slaves get to freedom in Canada. Now, so Southerners were happy to see this bill passed because it did help them out, and they wanted to see these runaway slaves returned. Now, this compromise was not at first accepted by everybody. A prominent Whig from New York State, William Seward, he denounced the compromise as basically immoral because it would allow for the extension of slavery into new territories. Fire eaters, people like Yancey and Davis, they denounced the plan because it would allow California to enter the Union as a free state. Now, President Zachary Taylor at the time, he came out against the plan because he was proposing that both California and New Mexico, he wanted to see an enlarged New Mexico. He was saying, let them both enter as free states, which is interesting because he was a slave owner, but he was calling for all the new territories to enter the Union immediately as free states. So as long as Zachary Taylor, remember, he could veto any law of Congress, as long as he was alive, there was no hope for the passage of this compromise plan. But then in the midst of this crisis, Taylor unexpectedly got sick and died. And his vice president, Millard Fillmore of New York, he became president to fill out the remainder of Taylor's term. Now, Fillmore supported Clay and supported the compromise, and so now there was no obstacle from the White House to oppose the compromise. So what happened is that Senator Clay, Daniel Webster, and a new person on the scene, Stephen Douglas, they all worked together to get this compromise plan. Stephen Douglas was new to the Senate from Illinois, and he was called the Little Giant. He was a short man, but he had a lot of power. He could speak to a lot of people and was very persuasive, and he used his influence to get the Compromise of 1815 passed as a series of bills. Douglas was his mentor had been Lewis Cass, and so he supported the compromise plan because it put into effect the idea of popular sovereignty to decide the issue of slavery in the New Mexico and Utah territories. So after a lot of wrangling, a lot of footwork by Stephen Douglas, this bill passed in 1850. So the Compromise of 1850 went into effect. Now, the passage of the Compromise of 1850 resolved the crisis for now, but it sowed future conflicts, especially with that fugitive slave law. In the next lesson, we'll see how in the years following the Compromise of 1850, the division between the North and South continued to grow and violence escalated.